So now I can follow on from the sort of PhD. What do you do when you've finished your PhD? I was feeding into debates about indigenous knowledge at the time. There was Paul Richards' Indigenous Agricultural Revolution, Robert Chambers writing about sort of farmer first and participatory development. I wanted to be to come out of the PhD, but to be engaged with the challenges of the moment, and the challenges really were poverty across the world. Anthropology, I felt, could address that, but the second challenge that was emerging were challenges around the environment. I'd finished my PhD in 1990-91. There was the emergence of the Rio Earth Summit, Rio de Janeiro, where the governments of the world were coming together to address the environmental destruction, especially the destruction of forests. What could anthropology offer? What could anthropologists do to assist in this? And I had a friend at SOAS, Melissa Leach, who we'd encountered. We became partners in one form or another. She had worked in Sierra Leone. I'd worked in DRC, as was, or Zaire. And we decided that we'd actually try to do field work together as a pair. Partly because that would be more friendly, and partly because why could anthropology be only be done by individuals? She had a job, managed to get a job post-PhD. It's never very easy. She was at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. And there we started to think about research programs that we could do that would engage with the contemporary environmental policy. So we decided to go and work in West Africa, and in order to, and I would only work in Francophone countries, so that delimited us to sort of Côte d'Ivoire or Guinea and Togo or Benin. So we visited countries looking for a place that was facing deep environmental challenges, and to build up collaborations with the university networks and the ministerial networks and the international aid networks who were addressing deforestation especially. And we found a place to work in Republic of Guinea. Why? Because it was the place that the policymakers were most worried about. And we found that there was a region of Guinea which had suffered catastrophic deforestation in the last 50 years, a place called Kissidougou. And we'd read everything there was to know then about this place before putting in a research grant proposal to our aid donors who would provide research funding. And we'd found political scientists saying that the social transformations and political transformations around the Sékou Touré post-independence regime had led to an acceleration of the forest loss. There were people claiming that populations had increased that had led to the forest disappearing. There were economists who were seeing how there were transformations in ownership of land and rights that would leading to deforestation. There were anthropologists who were looking at the ways within which youth no longer respected the elders in their land practices, leading to deforestation. There were plenty of explanations for deforestation. There was a profusion of knowledge about it, and there were reports about this forest loss. So we were very easily drawn to write a research proposal called The Social Dynamics of Deforestation. And for this, we linked up with some really fantastic people within the Ministry of Eaux et Forêts, Water and Forests at the time. A guy called Uri Ba, who unfortunately died in a car crash later, but he was a very powerful, inspirational figure. He said, "This is a great research program. The only thing is you mustn't collaborate with us because we are hated more or less within the region as being an agent of state and of exaction. So do your research. We'll be interested in your research, but do it independently." So we did it independently through collaborations with the university, and we installed ourselves in this part of the Republic of Guinea called Kisidugu, which is in the southeast of the country, the forest region. And there we installed ourselves after discussing with intermediaries and political intermediaries in villages, in 2 villages, one of which was in a sort of more savanna-y area and the other was in a more forested area. And we wanted to look at what were, in a sense, the causalities and the consequences and the social relations around forest loss. And to do this, we also needed to do some archive work and some historical work about precisely where and when this forest loss had happened. And as we did the archive work, we found old maps that didn't show forest in the area. They did describe processes of deforestation, but and we found that there would be air photographs and satellite images available. And we started to do some oral history. We teamed up with 2 young Guineans, Marie Camino and Dominique Milamuno, who were from the region and therefore could speak the languages and create a team of 4 rather than a team of 2, as it were. And we went to work as farmers, as land users, apprenticing ourselves to people who were still within these villages, which were exceptionally poor. But the first kind of issue hit around sort of 4 or 5 months in, that there hadn't been any deforestation. Indeed, that the forests which we were encountering and walking through and getting to know, and the species within them, had been established around villages in savannas rather than being the relics of old forest, which puzzled us. And so we then did find old air photographs and realized that, yes, there hadn't been deforestation, at least not since the 1950s, despite everything that was written in all the documentation about the region. And despite all of the explanations for deforestation that were there in the policy documents from political scientists and economists and anthropologists even. You see, so all of a sudden we were faced with a much more interesting set of questions. How had we ever been drawn into seeing this landscape as one that was problematized? And it wasn't that it was an unknown issue. It was thoroughly known. There was so much knowledge about it. It's just that the knowledge was explaining something that hadn't happened. So what was the status of all of these international development documents that were explaining and responding to deforestation that hadn't happened? And that then drew us into understanding the production of knowledge within both colonial and post-colonial environmental institutions, and the ways within which African farmers were being cast by them. And then what could a local knowledge do by way of critique to not just those policy institutions, but the forms of knowledge that had been brought to bear on that locality. So once again, out of a small area suddenly become much bigger sets of questions around the relations of production of knowledge about a place. I mean, this is probably germane now, but at the time, that's not how we were understanding landscapes, to be honest. This was in 1992, 93, we were doing the field work. And it was, to us, shocking. So it was also wonderful. But the farmers we were living with knew this land really beautifully. They knew how to move trees, which they used to do, from certain riverside streams and plant them around villages, and in their ancestral times had made rings of trees around their villages in this way, cutting the branches and the stems to force the branching to interlace the trees together, and then introducing lianas and other crops into these forests, some of which were spiky and would add to a sort of defensive structure that was almost like a fortress, and others that would render other plants that were useful, whether it was for medicines or for oils and so on. So these forests had been sort of constituted also through a whole set of much wider practices of grazing animals and so on. Incredibly sophisticated manipulation of vegetation to shape the landscapes according to needs, as it were. Anything but deforestation, anything but, and some of the policy documents were suggesting this was almost vandalism, that was coming out. There was some very emotive phrasing there. But anyway, I should say that there were also sort of techniques in controlling fire that were used. So you put in fires early in the dry season, and that would create a kind of fire that wouldn't do damage to the vegetation, but that would protect it for later in the season. But this was at a time when the setting of fires carried heavy penalties in the region. The death penalty, in fact, from within the locality. It was never instituted, but it was certainly on the books. So there was a kind of pathologization, a criminalization of farmers who had this very sophisticated understanding. So it wasn't, and here we were as outside researchers, we were going to join in this. You follow? And it was only through anthropological fieldwork and through listening and through 6 months or 8 months, 10 months that we began to pick up the real problem that this globalized framing and globalized science had brought. So what did we do? We wrote a book called Misreading the African Landscape. We made a film about it called Second Nature. But we also looked into the history. How had this come to pass? Because if you read contemporary policy documents, they said 50 years ago this place was wall-to-wall forest. Go to the policy documents from 50 years ago, they say this place was once forest but isn't today, but back in 1900 this was wall-to-wall forest. And then you go to the policy documents back in 1900 and people are describing the same landscape or similar landscape, but still thinking that it had been deforested. So somehow this idea that this landscape had been a problem was a really old outcome of unevidenced history, but forms of knowledge that were evidenced within readings of landscapes. So if you go into a landscape where there is forest, there was a kind of an assumption that where there is forest, there in neighbouring areas where there isn't forest, there could be. And if there could be, there once was. So you could deduce that the natural vegetation was was forest somehow, and foresters had developed these ideas that there's this kind of climax vegetation that any region has under a certain rainfall and a certain soil type, and that we can know what this climax is, and then we can read the landscape according to that. So what we began to see was that ideas of coloniality and of disempowerment and of pathologizing were written into the science of ecology in West Africa. That it wasn't that in order to be an anthropologist, we needed to see how these political and social relations had become incorporated into the very realities. The ways trees grow, the ways landscapes are shaped by soil and water, the ways soils form, the way nature is understood. And these, suddenly we could see that there was a colonial critique, not just of sort of extraction and the forced labour and those kinds of things, but that there was a critique of the sciences as they had become emergent within this locality. So, of course, we were beginning to look at anthropological engagements with science and the production of knowledge. I mean, clearly the work of Foucault and the production of truth and relations between knowledge and power, that was very, sort of helped us to that. But so did contemporary science studies and social and science and technology studies, kind of literatures that we could begin to mobilize to help understand this outcome. Let me just. Because this outcome had occurred, as it were, not through a lack of research, but through a century of research. This region had acquired political independence within a radical regime of the Sékou Touré, who was linked to Patrice Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah in a kind of Africanization and a resurgence of African politics. But this independence was operating without an independence from the coloniality of science, if you follow. So on the one hand there was political independence, and indeed in certain areas there was an Africanization of medicine and of medical practices, but not in ecology and environment. And it was this we found really interesting also to pursue. So that book, Misreading the African Landscape, it covers many topics, because it is both an analysis of indigenous agricultural and ecological practices, showing the logics behind the nurturing of vegetation in different parts of the landscape. But it's also then a kind of teasing up and inquiring into the history of the production of knowledge about these landscapes within colonial and post-colonial international development worlds.